There's a lot of information on the internet regarding grief. You can find information about the loss of a parent, the loss of a sibling, the loss of a pet, but there's not a lot of information out there regarding the loss of a service dog. I was, a fairly normal 21-year-old, whatever that means. I had a part-time job. I was driving myself to school. I auditioned for plays. I was living on the Gulf of Mexico at the time, so I spent a lot of time on the water. I was a fairly average college senior, and then suddenly, I wasn't. I had my first grand mal seizure back in 2014 and was diagnosed with epilepsy shortly after that. The moment that I received my diagnosis, my life changed. I didn't grow up with seizures, so I didn't know what a life with having them would look like. I couldn't drive anymore, so I dropped out of college. I withdrew from any semblance of a social life. I guess I didn't want to be a liability to my friends or a burden, but that was a time of overwhelming loneliness that I had not experienced before. After a while, I started researching ways to regain a sense of normalcy, and I discovered that dogs could be trained to mitigate life with seizures. So I contacted Service Dogs Alabama and talked to them about their program, and they encouraged me to apply to be a client. And after submitting an application with so many doctor's notes and referrals and waiting about a year, I was matched with Earl. You'd think it would be intuitive handling a service dog, but Earl wasn't a pet, and he certainly wasn't like any normal dog. I think I called Service Dogs Alabama every other day for a month just to ask what I was doing wrong. He was perfectly trained, but he had this stink face. He was only 1.5, but he acted like a crotchety old man. I was devastated that I couldn't seem to get him excited or happy about anything. The trainers told me that that's just who Earl was. Even as a puppy, he had this really serious demeanor. They explained that it was a working relationship and that we would have to take some time to get to know each other. So we took things slow, and eventually we just fell in love. Earl became like an appendage. He went everywhere with me, and he never failed to respond when I collapsed. He went with me to weddings, to the grocery store, to doctor's appointments, to jury duty. We gave speeches to large groups about service dogs, and I got to start flying across the country by myself to see my parents because of him. We even traveled to Copenhagen and Paris together. He was a perfect travel buddy. I finally re-enrolled in college and made friends because everyone wanted to get to know him. I gained so much confidence, not only in my ability to re-enter society, but I generally became a more outgoing person. I'm pretty sure most of my friends loved him even more than they loved me. We were a we. It wasn't a Mary Ryan and her service dog thing, but we were a collective. He was a medical device, sure, but he was also like a child and a caretaker, a protector, a hype man, and a best friend. He never did stop acting like a crotchety old man, but he was everything to me. He was perfect. And then, just like I was after my epilepsy diagnosis, suddenly Earl wasn't himself. Earl had his first collapse in May of 2020, and my husband and I spent a month and a half going back and forth to emergency vets and specialists trying to figure out what was wrong with him. Every time we'd bring him home, we'd have to rush him right back to the emergency room and stay for a couple of nights. He saw specialists in Alabama, Florida, Utah, and we even had an appointment with a veterinary neurologist in Denver, Colorado. After 2 months of stress and exhaustion, we asked the vet to keep him for a couple of days and run every test they could. He was our baby, and he was my protector. There was no limit to what we wouldn't do for him. The second day of that stint in the hospital, we got the call that shattered our world. Earl had an aggressive form of leukemia, and his health was rapidly declining. We did everything we could to try to make him comfortable, but we lost him shortly after that. The grief of losing him was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. First, I mourned the loss of my best friend and caretaker. A few days later, I realized I no longer felt comfortable going out in public alone, so I mourned the loss of my independence and security. I felt halved, like this huge piece of me was just gone. And then I realized, oh my gosh, I have this whole community to break the news to. He meant so much to so many people, and I have to be strong enough to talk about him with these people who loved him like I did. You have to mourn with this whole village of people who knew and loved him. I called Service Dogs Alabama and cried with the founder of the organization for almost an hour. I called my parents, who felt like they had lost a grandchild. I couldn't bear to call my friends who knew and loved him, so I made a post about his passing on social media. I felt selfish doing that, but I didn't have the strength to have that conversation more than a couple of times. After the initial shock of Earl's passing, sorrow would come in waves. I'd be fine for an entire day, and then I'd find an Earl hair on the duvet cover as I crawled into bed and just lose it. I had my husband go alone to pick up groceries, and I postponed appointments just because I couldn't trust that I could maintain composure in public. I kept having to remind myself that my pain was natural and okay because I felt awful for being so fragile. I had to indulge the things that my emotions told me that I needed. For example, I slept on the couch for a while because he used to sleep in bed with me. I asked my mother to come stay with me for a week because I, an adult woman, needed my mommy to come take care of me. I had to throw away perfectly good food that week because I couldn't bear to eat the food that I was eating when the vet called to tell us about his diagnosis. I still haven't made that dish since then. I thought when I received his ashes that I would restart the grieving process all over again, but I felt like we were finally reunited in a way. Don't get me wrong, I cried for hours when I picked them up, but it was this sense of relief to have him with me again. I planned to scatter his ashes on the Gulf Coast, but I just can't let him go yet. I'm still not ready. It's been nearly a year and I'm still grieving. But I think it's okay to keep him around for a while I still need him. My house is basically a shrine to him. I had his vest and collar mounted in a shadow box, and I have a portrait of him in the kitchen so that he can always watch me while I'm cooking. Like a typical lab, he wanted to taste everything I ate. It seemed only appropriate to mount his picture there. My story is not prescriptive. I can't tell anyone what to do with these huge, overwhelming, complex emotions or how long the bereavement period will be. But I created this project so that no one will have to go through that painful time alone. It's nearly impossible to find information out there regarding the loss of a service dog. I found plenty of information out there about the loss of a pet and a few blog posts here and there with some personal stories, but they really weren't enough. I didn't need a timeline about how long my sadness would last per se, but I just felt like I needed some framework for what I was going through. I felt like I needed some support during one of the most difficult times in my life, and I hope that this film can be that for someone else. Earl gave me my life back. He gave my life meaning again just by being who he was. And I pray that in sharing my mourning process and crying on camera and revealing the weird forms my grief has taken, that I'm returning that favor.